Welcome to Soul Connections. I'm Emily.
I'm Dani.
Soul Connections is a podcast about the experiences and relationships that light us up. This includes our relationships with the human, more than human, and celestial. Lights us up is really what guides us through these storms of crisis and fuel us with the joy to continue on our journey. Soul Connections is created because we are living through deep times of uncertainty, compounding crises, and we wanted to interview people in our community who are really aligned with what lights them up. And when I say what lights us up, how I experience this in my body is being in a relationship with someone or an experience that I'm having where I feel like my heart space expands tenfold, and I feel so deeply connected to my heart space, and I feel a lightening in my body, and I feel almost in a flow state where I'm connected to something much larger than myself. If you want to think about that as universe or source or spirit or God, is what I'm talking about when we say what lights us up. It really is emanating from our heart, and kind of emanating out and connecting us to a force bigger than ourselves that is invisible to us. And the great thing about what lights us up is that it is quite a journey to get there. I really view life as a spiral and not as linear point A to point B, but a spiral, cycles that we are constantly going through, a labyrinth that is dark where we don't have the map and we don't know the route, but we are simply listening to our hearts and weaving through these experiences and learning what doesn't light us up, experiences that cause us suffering or to dim ourselves. And so in today's interview, we will begin to have these conversations about what lights us up and our journeys to get to those experiences and those people and those relationships with the more than human that light us up. So I'm very excited to introduce our very first guest. They are our fellow co-host, Aryn Scanlon, and Aryn uses they, them pronouns. Aryn is a queer writer and astrologer based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. They hold a Bachelor's of Fine Arts in Creative Writing from Chapman University. Their poems and essays have been published online by Pulp Mag, Dismantle Magazine, Pussy Magic, South Broadway Ghost Society, and Chronotope Magazine. Scanlon also works with Sinister Wisdom, a multicultural lesbian literary magazine. Was a co-editor for Sinister Wisdom 128 Trans Feminisms, which was a finalist for the Leslie Feinberg Award from Publishing Triangle. They are currently queering their full-length debut lesbian YA young adult novel. They love collecting queer YA books, drinking iced lavender lattes, and standing frog and toads relationship. And relate on that one, Aryn. So welcome, Aryn. So excited to have you as our first guest to be interviewed.
Thank you. I'm really looking forward to talking about what lights me up.
And is there anything else you want to share with our listeners about you?
I think we're going to talk a lot more about my bio in our interview. But I guess one thing that I could add is I've lived in a lot of different places in the United States, and a through line in all of that is my connection to community. And I feel like Milwaukee is one of the first places where I've finally felt that I can really flourish and grow in the community gatherings and organizing and connections that I want to do. And I'm excited to talk more about how that relates to writing for me.
That's so excited to dig deeper into that. So first question for you, Aryn, because one of the things that connect us on this podcast is astrology. What is your sun, moon, and rising sign?
I am a Capricorn sun, Taurus moon with a Capricorn rising, and my sun and ascendant are really close to one another. My sun is at 20 degrees Capricorn, and my ascendant is 21 degrees in Capricorn. So they're right next to each other.
Earthy. We love it.
And today, the day that we're recording this podcast, Venus happens to be on top of your rising sign.
Unintentional, but perfect.
Unintentional on Venus's day. It's just a lovely connection.
And today, because I always forget to timestamp, today when we're recording is Friday, November 29th, 2024. This day.
Venus's day. So Aryn, you're excited to talk about it. What lights you up?
I think the first thing that comes to mind is writing. Writing has always been a huge practice for me growing up. I have a memory of having this little stationery, and I told my mom, leave me alone. I'm working. And what working meant was me writing random letters and characters because I didn't quite know how to write yet. But I don't know, just again, that childhood love of writing, and that is originated in reading. So books really light me up. Stories really light me up in all forms, like audiobooks, people telling their own stories, reading a book in a literal way. And I feel like writing is really deeply connected to community. And what really lights me up is connecting with specifically creative community, being in relation with other artists, not even necessarily other writers. I feel very inspired to be connected to all different kinds of mediums. And I actually like to interact with artists of different mediums, especially if I'm not an expert or aware of it, because I think there's something so enriching about creative practices just at a baseline. But recently also I have been connecting with other writers, and that has felt really inspiring and motivating to my own practice. And writing is one of those art forms where it is so solitary. You do it alone. And in the process of publishing and sharing, you get to connect with others and build community and relate. And so I think part of my role as a writer is not only a storyteller, but a truth teller. And recently I've been more interested in writing about my own truth. And I see what that does for people, because I've had feedback where they're like, wow, you talked about this really vulnerable, intimate thing. And it was really inspiring to listen to your story and then also connect with what that means to me, because with art, we're always looking for ourselves. So I like to kind of engage with that role as a writer of, I do it for myself first and foremost. And then also the fact that I can connect to others and community is also really special.
You talked about writing letters and symbols as a child. What were your early experiences with writing? How did you discover it for yourself?
Besides that memory, the other memory I have is being in 4th, 5th, 6th grade. And I remember writing stories about animals because I was obsessed with the Redwall series, which is I like to describe it as Tolkien for children, but with animals characters. So I remember writing these all kinds of stories, epic stories, adventure stories, silly stories. And I had a teacher in 6th grade who would have us do these writing exercises where he would show us a picture and he would be like, all right, come up with a story. And I remember there was this one of this nun sitting in a chair and she was floating. And so I have this very vivid memory of writing a story about that. And I always was really encouraged by teachers. I would oftentimes, if there was a writing prompt, I would go above and beyond. I would sometimes write multiple stories, even if they added just one and one. And I remember writing very moody poetry as a 14-year-old. And I really wish I still had access to it because it was so good. But I've also always loved music and lyrics too. And I think that is a good segue into poetry. Just really always really being connected to written word or spoken word, and feeling honestly a deep spiritual draw in the sense towards it too, where writing kind of feels like a compulsion for me. I can't not do it, but honing the practice has been important too.
Love hearing about that. One thing I have been deeply reflecting on the impact and the power of words. And I really like the simple phrase, which I probably heard on social media, that words are spells.
Mm.
And I've really been taking that into my own life and being more intentional. So I love hearing how spiritual writing has been for you. Um, so Aryn, with your experience, how, like, as you were really finding that this lit you up from a young age, which is so exciting, thinking about like finding your craft young, and holding on to that now into your 20s, late 20s. So how did writing for fun and self-expression transform into a desire to want to make this like a professional career path for yourself?
I think it goes back to this feeling of I need to pursue this, I need to do this. And in addition to being really encouraged by my teachers, I also had a blog growing up, and it was a fashion blog because I also used to want to be a fashion designer. And I loved that it connected me to so many people. It was like I was like 15, 16, 17, and I was interacting with like fashion bloggers, people who are really into like style and all over the world. And I actually made a magazine where I edited everything. I asked people, hey, can I put your images in this? Can I interview you? Can I ask you to write a poem? Or I would find people like on Tumblr or Flickr or other blogs and like kind of again bring it all together in like a magazine. And I didn't make any money. It wasn't about like, oh, I'm making this into a business venture. It was really it came from this desire to connect with other creatives and being like a kid of the internet, being very savvy and like very much like, yes, like this is what I'm going to do. So I think in terms of how it transitioned to professional, I even feel like when I chose creative writing in college, in my mind, I was like, I'm doing this because this is my path and this is what I really want, what I'm drawn towards. I wasn't even thinking like, how do I make money off of this? Like it wasn't a thought where I guess, I don't know, it wasn't a motivation in that sense. And I also was maybe a little naive and didn't quite understand like what it meant to be a professional writer or actually how hard it is to be a writer who like makes good money and writes books and such. So that was a process to learn as well. But I remember deciding between either fashion college or creative writing. And creative writing is what won out. And I was specifically looked for schools where it was like, no, it wasn't just English with a writing focus, it was creative writing.
And from when we talked before, I know you had a really like pretty profound college experience with some amazing mentors and friends and other creatives and collaborators. Will you tell us a bit more what it was like to be in a creative writing program and to get your bachelor's in that?
Yeah. So one of my mentors, Alicia Cosme, was amazing. I took multiple classes with her. She was a writer from Argentina and she was older. So when she was a college student in Argentina, they had something called the Dirty War, where there was a military dictatorship. It was incredibly repressive, especially towards artists and creatives. And she was actually imprisoned for like political protests. And so her first book is a story about her experience in a woman's prison. And I remember specifically, she talks about they would communicate with each other through in the bathroom, like through the pipes. And so she really introduced me to literature created in repressive political contexts. And a lot of the stuff that she shared with us were other writers, usually within Latin America, who were writing under heavy censorship. So I remember this one novel, I can't remember what it's called, but it's by this Chilean author, where you read it and it's very like surreal. And you're like, what is actually happening here? But there's really visceral, emotional kind of reactions that you have from it. She was a big fan of like Ulysses by James Joyce, like kind of like modernist writers who really pushed the like what is writing, what is story, how do we frame it, how do we structure it. So in college, I was really interested in this like fragmentation of writing, and actually my thesis was sort of like a prose poetry experimental novella, where it was experimental poetry, but also like telling a story. And it was like the story of like my becoming. So I called it The Hurt of Becoming, which is a reference to Andrea Gibson's line, "It hurts to become," because I just really like this idea that becoming is painful, especially like as a youth and an adolescent. So the book really explored like my parents' relationship, my experience as a child, and this kind of reconciliation with like, who am I? Like, yes, I come from this. Is that who I am? Does that define me? Do I define me? So there's a lot of questions about this, and I never published it, and that was kind of fine with me because it was very like vulnerable and personal exploration. And actually, that project led me to also create a visual piece for it, which was very like collage oriented, where I would have like excerpts from my book. I would have photographs that I would take of myself. I took a black and white photography class in college too, so I had like that. I had broken shards of mirrors, so it was like this big collage piece. And I had a lot of friends who were in the art program, and so they had access to gallery spaces. So I was like, what if we made a show so I could show my piece? And through that, like art students got involved. My dance friends got involved and did performances. My other like writer poetry friends also did spoken word. So again, it's like I write by myself and then I'm ready to share. And then I get to help curate and create spaces where other artists can then share their feelings and their work and their expressions as well. And that was like so cool to have that culmination. And I did not have to do that. It was very extra of me. Like there was nothing in my program that was like, you have to like create an art piece in accordance with your thesis. Like that's something that I just wanted to do for myself. And it was really wonderful and satisfying to also be able to share not necessarily like my novella with other people, but to share this physical representation. And I had like an artist statement that talked about it too.
Love that a big through line of your writing practice has been that co-creation, collaboration, bringing different friends and artists together, different mediums and disciplines, and weaving them all together. That is so beautiful. And yeah, I loved also hearing about your teacher who was an Argentinian political prisoner. And we're going to read Aryn's chart a little bit later on, and they have very specific placements in the 12th house that I feel like really speaks to this, finding an inspiring mentor and professor who was a political prisoner, which political prisoners, any type of prisoner we can find in the 12th house. In astrology, it's isolation, it's imprisonment. So we'll show more about that. But when you told me that experience in college, I was like, that's right in your chart right here, which is super cool. So what was it like to transition from being a creative writing student into kind of having to enter, fully enter capitalist society and now have to somehow sell your labor to survive, as all of us do? What was that transition like for you, and what were your early years post-college like?
It was rough. I very much went into the world being like, oh, I got this. Like, I'm going to be a full-time writer. And it was like, actually, no, it's really hard to do it. I moved to New York City after I graduated, really on a whim. I had friends there. I didn't really know what I was doing. And I've always thought of New York as a really, yeah, cool place with like a lot of things happening, especially in a writing way. Like the literary scene there is cool. So I worked in food service when I was there, but what I actually found really amazing is I would have my nightly job where I would go in for like dinner service, and during the day I would go to a coffee shop and just write and write and write. So I did get into this flow where I was like, listen, I don't necessarily know how this is going to make me money, but I need to do this. This is like what's really speaking to me. And so I think I'm actually trying to get back to that, where I'm seeing less of my labor as necessarily even needing to be related to writing, because really I just want all that time and energy for my writing practice itself. So I did, though, when I moved to Florida, transition to be a teacher, and I wasn't really seeking that, but I just found a job and I was like, oh, being a literature teacher, this sounds amazing. And that job was actually so impactful to my writing experience because so the gig itself was a literature teacher, and I taught all age groups. So kindergartners all the way up to high schoolers. And it started in person. And then also I did a lot of online work as well. So I got to connect with kids all over the United States, sometimes in different countries. And it was so beautiful because while I was obsessed with like fracturing and disrupting narratives and like unconventional kind of stories, this job really helped me remember how much I love immersion, because the company's whole premise was, if we want to get kids to be readers, they need to be immersed into good fiction, meaningful fiction. And so that job made me remember what it was like to be a kid who just loved to devour stories for the sake of reading, not even analyzing it, right? So like that, the first experience of just being a reader and responding and reacting and having emotional feelings. And then I would get to talk about that with kids. And like, whether I was talking about Frog and Toad or like this, A Fault in Our Stars, like regardless of the age, I felt it was so fulfilling to not only hear what children thought and said, but also to connect with like my inner child in that process, and also to facilitate that for kids. So teaching was a really amazing career path that I did that I'm no longer in, but might find my way back to, because again, like I feel like that job like really connected me back to my love of narrative fiction. And I was focusing a lot on poetry and or more like experimental prose. And so I actually feel like that job kind of led me into the YA pipeline a little bit, because I've always loved YA, but it got me really back into it because adolescent literature is incredible in terms of like yes, they deal with hard themes, but there's always the persistent hope and faith, because I think that like kids need that. Like, I don't know, adult literature is great too, but sometimes you don't find that childlike wonder or whimsy in it. So
we all need that.
yeah,
Let's be real.
exactly.
We all need that.
Yeah. And so I think that job kind of led me back into, actually, I want to create like longer narratives with like kids or teenagers as the central protagonist.
It's so interesting to me because I really resonate with what you're talking about right now, with this kind of like, when you're in your like college years and stuff, it sounds like you kind of are going, you matured a lot, like as a writer, and like started to understand the system. It sounds like how it works, and the realities of how it works. And it was good that you were super confident coming out of that, like that confidence in any sort of art pursuit is extremely important, right? Also, you're a Capricorn, so like of course you're going to come out of it with like, I am the best, I'm going to be the best, and then I really, this journey with children's literature and young adult is also really lovely, because it softens that, and it brings it back to like, little you, writing symbols, you know what I mean? And it's like, that's really where the art is coming from, is like that part of you, so I just think that's a really beautiful reflection. I also think that it's pretty relevant for where you're at right now astrologically, because you're going through your Saturn's return right now. So for anybody who doesn't know, Saturn returns to the same degree and sign that you were born every like 27 to 30 years. It's 29 and a half years is what the cycle is, but it starts around the age of 27 and goes until like 32, as Saturn moves from the sign it was before you were born into the sign that it was when you were born, and throughout that sign. So for you, Aryn, your Saturn is in Pisces. And so, Saturn moved into Pisces. When did Saturn move into Pisces?
March of 2023.
March of 2023. And we haven't really talked a lot about your astrology practice in any of this, but Aryn is also an astrologer. That's how we're connected to them. So Aryn, just curious about your reflections on that. The Saturn's return is like a time of like, it's completing a full cycle and starting a new cycle. There's a maturation, but there's also a return to the child self and to the teenage self and to the reasons we do things, you know? So this journey that you're talking about is relevant right now, you know, of you were, you know, maturing, climbing the mountain as the Capricorn, and then being like, all right, where have I come from and what has happened, and now where am I going with that? So how do you feel like that has impacted your writing practice and like personally?
Yeah, I think in terms of my writing practice, it's really helped think about what is my practice? What does that actually look like? Which again, Saturn is like, yeah, what's your system? What's your strategy? And also being in Pisces, it's been fluid. And so also too, my Saturn in Pisces is my chart ruler. And so I've always kind of like, yes, identified with the Capricorn, kind of like my nose to the grindstone. Like I'm really good at initiating and like doing that. And I really feel the mermaid tail of the Mergo, where I feel like I'm very fluid, I'm very flexible, I'm very creative. And so I think maybe the Saturn return is more of just figuring out what that looks like and how that works for me. So I feel like my writing practice is kind of all over the place because it's very intuitive, and I could, I wrote a novel, but I also love to write poetry and like kind of a haiku kind of esque, where it's not so much the structure of haiku, but the kind of principle behind it is this hyper focus on the present moment. And so that's like one way that I kind of engage with that creative flow. Then I also like to write like auto fiction, essay style. And then also with my astrology practice, I'm getting back into writing about astrology, but in a lens where it's less of like, here's this placement and here's what it means. It's more of here's this thing happening or this placement, and this is how I'm thinking about it and how I relate to it and experience it. And so that in particular feels really satisfying, because I think for a while in my astrology practice, I was just kind of doing what I saw other people doing. And I was and maybe that was just part of the journey where I was just trying to figure out like what is my lens when it comes to astrology. And Saturn return has deepened that. And especially because with my teaching, I was also building my astrology practice, and I had a blog for a while too, before I was like a teacher in a brick and mortar setting. So I had another teaching job where I was like really focused on that because I really needed to be. And that also was around the time my Saturn return started. So I kind of like took a step back from my astro practice. Now I'm returning to it more. And so, yes, I think the themes are a deepening of my actual practice, astrological, and my writing and my art. And then also a maturation of how I understand it, and more understanding of like where I fit, and also realizing that where I fit is mutable, changeable, like so Piscean, very connected to like what is within me, and that is what leads me. Like I have a hard time forcing myself to write things that I'm not feeling deeply like called to do.
When you say that, more feel like writing things that you're not feel completely called to do. What does that look like? What do you mean by that?
I think it's like, okay, for example, right, with astrology, writing about astrological transits is a great tool to be like, yeah, I'll help that, get that going. But sometimes the way I experience transits, I'm like, I don't have anything to say. I just want to like experience it. And so I think I've like taken some pressure off of myself, where I'm like, you don't have to have a hot take on everything. And Emily and I have talked a lot about that too, where like if you have that framework of like, this is what I have to write, the people need to know my thoughts, it takes away the joy, it takes away the sincerity behind it. And also it feels, again, more mechanical and robotic than I like to engage with my astrological practice. So I think leaning into what's calling me, if I'm sitting down at my Substack and looking at a blank screen and I'm like, I actually don't know what I want to say, I don't really have an idea. Or sometimes I sit down and like, I'm going to talk about this, and it just flows out of me. So part of it is kind of identifying when I'm in certain states of ebb and flow, what kind of topics I'm drawn to. And sometimes there are things I want to talk about, but I'm not ready to talk. They need to simmer, they need to wait, very Saturnian of like, I have this idea in my head, it's not quite ready to be birthed yet. I need to do other things first, other side quests, other projects before I can get to that point. That's actually how I feel with my second novel that I want to write, where I'm like, I actually had to write something else first before I was ready to take on this project.
It's really interesting because it seems like you kind of are in always, I mean, being a Capricorn and being Saturn ruled, but having your Saturn in Pisces, like you're kind of always in a process of like returning to your like authenticity, like what's like really there in terms of your creative, like you have all this power as a Capricorn to be able to manifest and make happen, you know, but also a very grounded understanding of the limited resources and energy. We'll look at your chart later, but you know, Taurus moon, like you have a fundamental understanding of that, of your resources and energy that you have available to you, you know, so, but you can't, like Saturn and Pisces isn't going to let you like not be authentic and real to what really like, you know, lights you up, or like, you know, your soul is wanting from you, you know, or like the ancestors are wanting from you, you know what I'm saying? And, you know, you talked a little earlier about becoming a teacher and then how that kind of has influenced your writing. You recently paused your teaching journey, right? And you wrote a young adult novel. Is that right? Would you tell us a little more about that journey and where you're at right now?
Yeah, so I quit my job pretty suddenly, and it came from the fact that it was no longer sustainable for me. Teaching is exhausting, regardless of any capacity that you do it. Teaching in person is especially exhausting. And so I hit a breaking point with my job. I also like recently ended a relationship that lasted a really long time. So there was like really big, impactful shifts, which again, Saturn, it's like very poignant, where it's like, actually these things that like you thought served you no longer do. So it's time to shift and restructure your life. And so I actually did write my novel though in the context of that teaching job. So despite the fact that I was working like 50-hour weeks and like totally drained and exhausted, on the weekend, I was very disciplined about writing this. And it took me, I want to say 6 months, 6 to 7 months to write like 100K words. And I did have help. I hired one of my really amazing writer, editor friends. And that process was like, I think that's why I was able to finish it in the first place. And so, yeah, now I'm kind of thinking my writing is my priority. What I do for money is actually not as important anymore. And that's been a big Capricorn wake up call, right? Because I think Capricorns kind of internalize, oh, my work is my value. And also, you know, I have the ascendant and the sun in Capricorn. So I definitely struggle with this feeling of like how I perform in a work or professional setting is really deeply intrinsically tied to like my value, which is also very influenced by capitalism. And so I'm trying to detach from that a little bit, trying to detach from this, like, actually, maybe I don't need to climb the career ladder. Like, actually, maybe I need to follow the light, which is writing and stories. And so this novel that I wrote, I'm currently in the process of querying literary agents, is really special to me in the sense that it's a made up story, but it has so many important things I want to say and talk about. And I just love YA fiction as a container for some of these experiences. And I think also being an adult who loves YA and knows a lot of other adults who love YA, like everybody relates to like that coming of age story, because that is a process that happens again and again. And with Saturn, like a Saturn return, like in some ways, like it's a coming of age. You're not a teenager per se, but you're an adult on the threshold of a different level of being an adult. So I actually think it's really interesting that I finished a novel, like a YA novel in this period. And I actually have a notes app, like an app or a note in my phone that was like Saturn return prediction. I write a book that I really care about. And it came true.
That's so poignant and true and really cool, like example of it. But like, yes, that I feel like the Saturn's return, you know, it's really a time that the first time in your life that you look upon your adulthood with a historical lens. And so, and that experience is pretty it's like, oh wow, like I'm no longer in that period of my life anymore. That's history now for me. But I was an adult then, like it's not like I was just a child anymore, up until that point, everything we look at is our childhood prior to where we're at now. And now, Saturn's return is the time when we're like, oh, there's it's a reflection time for sure. And especially in Pisces, as being the last sign and being a water sign and being reflective and being, about the connection that everything has to everything, it connects the end to the beginning again, I do think Saturn in Pisces, like there is something about reflecting on and, kind of choosing what stories that it sounds like you're carrying with you, and are gonna, put your focus on. And I'm a huge YA fan. I love, like that's what gets me going, like reading, you know what I mean, is that kind of stuff. So I'm excited to read your book when it comes out.
Aryn, I was going to say the same thing. I was like, I cannot wait to read this novel. And when you told me about the two characters, I don't know if you want to share any bit of the plot, but when you shared it with me, it so deeply resonated with some of my own personal experiences that I was just like, I am meant to be one of Aryn's readers. And I really love that about the art that we create, and that we have people that are meant to receive that art and relate to that art. And I love finding the art that, again, it's kind of like that what lights me up when I'm talking about, like, kind of like our soul's work. Like, what are we meant to do here? Not in a capitalistic sense, but what is our soul's true purpose, or what are the things that bring our soul's meaning that's maybe more about our destiny and our karma or our dharma. And so but art, oh my gosh, I have a similar feeling when I encounter any type of art that just, I'm like, wow, I am like just so connected with this artist. What they're like, there is a wavelength between us right now, and it is beautiful. And I am with you. I love YA, even TV. Like, I love YA TV. I love YA books. I just read a really good book. I don't know if it's technically YA, but one of the main characters is a 15-year-old girl. So she is like, a lot of the chapters are from her perspective, and I just loved it. So, Aryn, would you want to talk more about the plot of your novel?
Yeah, so it's one of those books that has alternating POV, first person. So the first chapter you get one character, other chapter, and it switches between, and sometimes they'll even switch when they're together, different perspective, which I love. It's such a fun way to read. And I also am super character driven when it comes to my stories. I love characters, and I actually think part of my writing practice is my observation. So like if you're my friend, I will write down things that people say. I will write down observations that I have. Like it is a constant process for me. And that actually I think makes me a really good dialogue writer because I pay attention to what people say. But anyway, so alternating point of view, two girls, and they're very different. So like the archetypes and the tropes that I'm working with, we have the lazy genius skateboard mask of center lesbian, right? Who like is everyone's like, dude, you're so smart. You should just need to try more. And like, you are destined to make a ton of money in the STEM field. But she feels really disillusioned by that because her dad walked out on her and her mom 2 years ago. So she's like, why would I care about the future? Like, my dad didn't. So we have Cal, that character. Then we have Sophie, who recently was discharged from an eating disorder facility. And that's something that I experienced as a teenager. And I really wanted to write a story about recovery, not necessarily. I mean, yes, in some ways I do reference like it is very difficult having an eating disorder, and it has a really big impact on your mental health and the people around you. But I didn't want to spend too much time in that realm where it would be really triggering or potentially like do the opposite of what I want to do, where I help people kind of understand what this is rather than glorify it or sensationalize it. So Sophie's in that experience. She comes out of that. She had to drop out of school. And she's finding her best friends won't talk to her. She's really struggling, kind of reintegrating into her life. And she is very different in Cal in the sense that she's very type A. Her parents are like, you're going to an Ivy League. She comes from wealth. And so she again, like both my characters have very different like class orientations, but they have this relationship with each other, which is really special and really sweet. And I wanted it to be a combination of like that classic, like rom-com feel good feeling, but also like they deal with really real things and they kind of rub up against each other in ways that disrupt their personal status quos, if that makes sense. So, Cal rubs up against Sophie's kind of rich girl orientation where she just takes a lot of things for granted or doesn't quite see like her privilege or the access that she has. And Sophie kind of rubs up against Cal's like, I don't really care. I'm going to worry about this later, like avoidant tendencies. And so the story is very much them contending with their own things, but with each other. And there's strong themes of like friendships. Like they both have really sweet, amazing friends that rally for them. So it was really fun to write YA and like really expand both of these characters. And it's also based in Milwaukee, which I thought was really important because more Midwestern queer representation, especially in the literary world.
I'm so excited for a queer YA novel, more queer YA storylines. And this actually really weaves in perfectly, Aryn. I think another big part from what you've shared with me and just my outside perspective is that your queerness and your transness has been a huge part of your Saturn return as well. And obviously, being queer influences your art and your writing. And we've kind of been hitting on these themes of one, Saturn return as yet another coming of age, really being kind of birthed into this like true, like, I don't know, concentration of adulthood and really leaving like, like traditional youth behind. But then also as queer people, we also go through multiple coming of ages. And 31 and I have had like a really big like coming out in the last couple of years, and I really related to the queer experience of having like almost going through another adolescence, which is yet another coming of age, but coming into your queerness no matter what age you are. So I'm curious if you'd be willing to talk about like your Saturn return and how that has impacted your journey as a queer person.
Yeah, I mean, I figured out I was non-binary / trans like before my Saturn return, but since my Saturn return has happened, I mean, I literally started taking like HRT, like testosterone. So the literal physical manifestation of like, I'm going through second puberty. But I also think too, just more of the acceptance of how I am and how this then impacts my worldview and my perspective. And also the feeling of I know who I am historically and there's all this potential as well. And I think even with like my experience with my transness is that I feel I don't look at my younger self and think that was wrong or that wasn't the correct manifestation or that wasn't the true me, because it was. And for a while I did really like resonate with being like a teenage girl and like a girl in general. But then as I got older, expanding and pushing also back against the sort of heteronormativity, like things that maybe kept me from truly like accessing or experiencing that. So yeah, definitely feeling like very poignant that all of this is kind of happening within the context of Saturn return, and especially in like I know who I am, but now I'm ready to share it with the world and articulate it in a way. Because I think for a really long time, like I was kind of doing this like dual kind of thing where I would go to, especially my teaching job, I would go to work and present in a certain way and even use like my given name. But then like with my queer friends in my community, I was going by Aryn and I was using different pronouns. And so now I'm like, okay, we're not doing that anymore. We're combining, we're like fully integrating into becoming the sort of true version that I see myself as. And that feels very Saturnian. And it took some time to get there. But now that I'm there, I'm ready to like really sink into it and like stay rooted in it.
I'm so happy for you and thank you for sharing that. And so would now be a good time to transition into Aryn's chart, because there's something I wanted to point out with you being a Capricorn rising and of course how this Saturn return is going to deeply influence your identity your body, your, just who you kind of consciously perceive yourself as. Danielle, is there anything you would like to add before we dive into Aryn's chart?
Let's transition when it makes sense. That's good.
Perfect. So this portion of the interview, and I think we will probably do this for most of our guests because we are all astrologers.
If they're willing to share their chart. Some people might not be, and that's okay. But yeah, if people are willing to share their chart, I would love to do this.
Yes, because this is how we relate to one another. This is how we learn about each other. And we want to share astrology as like pattern making, meaning making. I think we've been talking a lot about like what I refer to as just living the astrology. And so it's fun to get to know each other on deeper levels and then think about each other's charts and be like, hey, Aryn, you said this. This is what I see in your chart that relates to that. So Danielle, why don't you open us up with some of the things you see in Aryn's chart, or Aryn, whoever wants to share first.
Yeah, I mean, I can. I can look at it. I talked a little bit earlier. I've looked at Aryn's chart a couple of times now, but I haven't done a whole huge deep dive. So this is just some of the stuff that I initially noticed. But obviously the Sun and Ascendant conjunction at 20 and 21 degrees of Capricorn. And I also think that Neptune being right there with it is pretty impactful to how that expresses for you. And this is the thing I love about astrology is these patterns show up in so many different ways in charts usually. So we see this Saturn, Neptune, Capricorn, Pisces connection here in the chart, as well as with the Saturn in Pisces placement at 8 degrees of Pisces. And that's just so beautiful and lovely that the connection because that Saturn in Pisces rules over the chart, and that Saturn in Pisces is ruling over a chart that is heavy Capricorn influence with the Neptune conjunct the Sun in the rising. So and that means Capricorn can get a rap for being Machiavellian or ends justify the means type energy, because Capricorn is a worker and a climber, but you made a comment earlier. You're I identify more with the mermaid, or sometimes with the mermaid tail of the mer goat. So for people that don't know, Capricorn's symbol is actually a mer goat, a mer goat. I'm going to emphasize the mer because
sea goat,
a sea goat. And it's a goat's head with a mermaid's tail. So there is a connection to the depths of the water with the Capricorn energy that sometimes gets forgotten about with the goat side of things. And you just have such a really strong emphasis on that side of Capricorn energy. So I want to open it up with that. There's other stuff also with your 12th house, which is also Pisces house. I think when we first started talking about this podcast, I was like, are you a Pisces in some way? Because you feel like a Pisces to me. And you have these Piscean, but they're grounded with this Saturnian Capricorn, capacity. And to me, I'm sitting here listening to all the things you've created in your life, even writing 100,000, words in 6-8 months. It just feels very that's Capricorn can do it. And then also you have the inspiration and belief and Jupiterian, access to all those words. You know what I'm saying? So I'm curious what your experience is like with that dynamic, if you want to speak to that a little bit between the kind of Saturn, Neptune, Pisces, Capricorn connection you have going on.
Yeah, I think I want to say Capricorn archetypes are really good at actually doing what they dream about. And I think I really benefit from the Piscean kind of influence, right? Because I have this vivid imagination and I have the grit to kind of make it my reality. So I do feel like I have that that relationship between here's the vision, here's my plan. I can get really gritty about the details and the way that I achieve that. And so I also like what you said, Dani, about the faith, because part of having that Saturnian process of like the time and the commitment is in some ways influenced. You have to have faith in what you're doing. You have to believe that it's worth doing, that it has an impact. And so that's not always easy for me per se, but I do think based on these sort of astrological, I suppose, gifts that I've been given just by being born in this time, is I have that ability to really meld the practical on my earth with these creative visions, which I think do kind of feel like they have an origin in the mutable aspects of my chart with like my Venus and Sag and my Saturn and Pisces.
Yeah, I was just going to say that too about the Venus Jupiter conjunction in Sagittarius in Pisces house. Like when we talk about faith, that is like such a placement for like pointing your arrow towards what matters to you and like always kind of orienting to that. The thing that's different between Pisces and Sag actually square each other. They challenge each other in the zodiac, and that challenge to me is like Pisces can be a little more directionless sometimes, but you do have this like Saturn placement that kind of brings it back into focus, and then you have your Jupiter and Venus placement to be like, we can do it, like it's all possible, so that's really interesting.
I wanted to build upon this. So this is Jupiter, this is Venus. Jupiter rules Sagittarius and Pisces. So Jupiter is in their home sign of Sagittarius. So when we keep talking about like Aryn's belief in their vision and like an imagination, like I think belief in the vision and belief in your imagination and that it like you can make it a reality, like that faith, that is Jupiter and Sagittarius to me. And you add Venus in a very close conjunction, and it's like you believe in your creative expression, you believe in your art form. So it's just adding that art and that creativity and your relationships into that belief. And how I think of Saturn and Pisces, and again, this is Aryn's chart ruler. And when we say chart ruler, we take the ascendant, which is right here, and Aryn has their ascendant in Capricorn. And we have to look at who rules Capricorn. Saturn does. So then we look at Saturn in their chart. And so Saturn and Pisces in the third house is Aryn's chart ruler. And that is one of the most important, most impactful planets kind of in Aryn's life. And how I like to think of the natal chart is like the unfolding, like the seed of our life and the unfolding of our fate and our fortune in this lifetime. And so I think of Saturn and Pisces as, being really inspired and uplifted by this Jupiter in Sagittarius in the 12th house, really given Aryn this profound imagination and this dream space. And also, we talked about writing as a solitary practice. When Aryn's in their solitary writing practice, this is when this Jupiter and this Venus are really activated into their Saturn in the third house, because the third house is also where we get communication and oral and written storytelling. The third house is really about sharing our voice and sharing our stories and relating to the environment around us. So I just think it's so beautiful. And I have to point out this Mercury, because we're talking about writing. Mercury is the planet of communication. Mercury is the planet of storytelling, of commerce, of the details, of just zipping in between. And so Aryn has Mercury in Aquarius, which to me, so shout out to all the Mercury and Aquarius out there. I really see that as like the genius Mercury, the Mercury who is able to just have such a awareness and a vision of just constructs of society, really just being able to have that like hawk's view, like mentally of the world around them, of the social structures, and then really committed to, I also think of Mercury in Aquarius as someone who can really devote themselves to research and really like that Saturnian kind of long, like haul of doing really deep research, which writers, especially book writers, have to do a lot of research for their book. And you have Mercury in your second house. The second house is how we resource ourselves. And this can also include how we resource ourselves financially. So it's like you're resourcing yourself through your Mercury. And this Mercury is also ruled by your Saturn in Pisces because it's Aquarius. So those were some of my reflections.
Well, it's also interesting to bring it even further with this Saturn, all this, Saturn and Pisces ruling all this stuff. You're going through your Saturn's return right now, right? And the Saturn in Pisces ruler is Jupiter, is ruled by this Jupiter and Sag in the 12th house. So we just have even like more of this like Jupiter, Saturn sort of relationship that, I think we talked about this the one time, a couple like conversations ago, where we were talking about Jupiter and Saturn actually being partners, not like at odds with one another. And it's the expansion and contraction, which is what makes everything go round, right? So I think that's a really beautiful connection. Do we want to look at the Saturn's return chart?
I actually just thought of one thing to point out. So here's Aryn's Saturn return chart. So we have, just for those who are watching, and I'm sorry, I need to figure out a better way to get like a circle or something to point these things out. But the inner chart is Aryn's natal chart. The outer circle are the transits. And so when we say Saturn return, this is a chart from about February of 2024. You can see it right here. Saturn is at 8 degrees. I'm so sorry. That's really bothering me with this little. Need to just not. Go. So this is Saturn in the sky. Saturn was at 8 degrees, 56 minutes, which is perfectly aligned with Aryn's natal Saturn at 8 degrees, 56 minutes. So this is the Saturn return. But the entire time, which is about 2.5 to 3 years that Saturn is transiting Pisces, that is the entire time you're going through your Saturn return. It gets really intense when you get this exact Saturn return. That's really like, I think of the Saturn return as a pressure cooker, and it's really restructuring our lives. It's really like catching up or looking at the foundation that we've built until this point in our lives, restructuring it and kind of rebuilding it and patching it up from like the foundation up to kind of continue on into the next Saturnian phase cycle of life for the next 28 to 30 years. It's not in this chart because Jupiter was not in Gemini yet, but Aryn's 6th house is Gemini. And as of May of 2024, Jupiter is in Gemini. And Aryn, I don't know when you wrote your novel, if it was while Jupiter was in Taurus or Jupiter was in Gemini. Either one would deeply relate, because if Jupiter was in Taurus, that's your 5th house. That's the house of creation. That's the house of what we give birth to. And then the 6th house is the house of hard labor, routines. So I feel like both 5th and 6th house speak to the actual process of book writing.
Yeah, and also the shopping it with Jupiter and Gemini too. Like in the 6th, Jupiter in the 6th specifically, like, networking, making connections. And that to me is like really hard labor, like trying to get your book out there, maybe even more so than the actual process of writing. I don't know. I'm curious what your reflection is, but I just wanted to jump in there with that.
Yeah, I would so much rather write than query, even though, it is very much like a process that takes a lot of commitment, because it's really about finding like right person, right time. And that's so subjective. That is so flat, like mutable. And so, yes, I actually did finish my novel. I want to say I finished like the final draft of June this year. And so that means that I wrote most of it, I think, during Jupiter in Taurus, but then a little bit of Jupiter in Gemini. And I also wanted to say too, with my Saturn return, my natal aspects with Saturn feel really activated. And I feel like I've learned a lot about how to integrate it. So within my chart, like my Saturn squares my Jupiter at 2 degrees, also Venus to an extent at 4 degrees. And then there's also a relationship with my Mars in Virgo, which squares my Venus more closely, and also my Jupiter, and then also has a 6-degree orb opposition with my Saturn. So like the connection between my 3rd house, my 9th house, my 12th house, a lot of stuff with like teaching, writing, relationships, my practice, my solitary practice how that connects to my community or the people around me. So that configuration has been really interesting to receive this activation. And I think I have a deeper understanding of how those planets are interacting with each other and communicating.
I want to point this out. I'm going to go back to your natal chart just so we can see it a little bit better. But this relationship that Aryn is talking about is actually what is referred to as a T square. So you have, for Aryn, it's in 3 of their mutable signs. Here's Virgo, here's Sagittarius, here's Pisces. This is a T square where we have Saturn and Mars in opposition. And then the T that is formed, like this would be like the top of the T, and then this would be the perpendicular base of the T, is this Venus and Jupiter in Sagittarius. And so there's tension between squares are very tense. They drive action. Like think of things that are just so frustrating and you feel stuck and you're just frustrated. Like that is the energy of a square, but that frustration that drives us into action to relieve it. And so there's tension between Aryn's Venus and Jupiter and Mars, and then Venus and Jupiter and Saturn. And then these are in an opposition. These are like totally at odds with each other. It's kind of like there's 2 parts of me. One part really wants to teach, Mars in the 9th house, but another part of me really just wants to root in building in my community and sharing my story in my community and writing. And then the release point where they find relief is in this part where the square is formed. The release is this Venus and Jupiter in the 12th house, where it's like, well, I need to really dive deep into my creative sanctuary, my writing sanctuary, my dream space, my imagination. And this is where I will find the release and find what's going to guide me through this tension.
Something I want to point out about that too, that Venus Jupiter conjunction, because we just did our Astro Church episode on Pluto and Scorpio and Mars. You have Pluto at 29 degrees of Scorpio, which 29 degrees is the energetic degree of any sign, and it means it's like the most potent. It's gone through the whole zodiac, like every degree of that sign. And Pluto especially moves so slow. So it's like literally just like soaked in every lesson of every single degree, because each degree has like a different meaning, depending on what kind of astrology you are practicing. So at 29 degrees of Scorpio, Pluto, as we talked about before, rules generations, right? And so Pluto in Scorpio is the millennial generation. It's associated with the millennial generation. At 29 degrees, we joke about how I always forget that you're actually, a millennial, technically in astrology, because I'm so deep into being like a center millennial, you know what I'm saying? Like, and you actually exist on this kind of like liminal space, and recently Pluto just went through, was sitting at 29 degrees of Capricorn and right in a sextile to that, in your first house. And so there's an element for you around, maybe this is what we were talking about earlier about your need to like be really authentic to what your like practice is calling you to, this like private practice that Emily was just talking about with like Venus and Jupiter, and like that Pluto placement being there, even though it's in the sign before and it's, a broad orb, but like I still would lump that in with this connection here. It's a very, very potent and powerful placement. And it also, like I said, it kind of exists in this liminal space a little bit, which Neptune energy is a liminal space, so like, your ability to navigate that, with the Saturnian grounding of like step by step navigating that, is really powerful. And that T square you were just talking about, like, in the astrology that I learned, the release point is the opposite of the square point. And that opposite is in Gemini in the 6th house, which is, either way you look at it, it's like that there's something about negotiating that dynamic between how you experience as an individual and in your solo private space, your art and your like purpose here, and then how you also use it in service, because the sixth house really to me is about how we are of service and like what we do to be of service, how you are in service to that, like that relationship. So I don't know. I just think it's really cool. And you do it in a really cool way because you've talked over and over and over again. Your midheaven in Scorpio is in the 11th house in whole sign astrology. So like your connection to community and like need to serve community, that Mercury and Aquarius placement, my resources are connected to my community, to other people, it's just it's a cool way you're like manifesting all of this stuff. Like I had an astrologer recently say this, and I'll say this to you. Like, I'm kind of obsessed with how you express it.
Aryn,
awesome.
I'm obsessed with your chart, and I want to mention time and see, Aryn, if you want to wrap up reflections on your chart before we kind of wrap up our interview today.
Sure. I think what I love about having astrologer friends is the way in which they can reflect things back to me in a way that's harder for me to see myself. It's like that thing where when you're a reader, you can like generate so much for other people, but then you look at your own chart and you're like, what? Or like, I don't know how to, yeah. So I appreciate both of you reflecting these things back to me because they do feel really accurate, and also just the multiple iterations of my writing and of my storytelling practice and of like how that's connected to teaching. One of my other astrologer friends, KP, pointed out to me that my Mars in Virgo is in my house of publishing, and my midheaven in my 11th house is like 11th house is the house of audience. So this idea that like what I publish and put out in the world connects me to my audience. And I really love that interpretation because it just feels really accurate where like my writing is really personal, and I do think about it how it's in service of a greater community goal. And so it feels really good to have avenues for expressing this thing within me that I just need to express anyway. But how amazing that it can be in the service of other people feeling seen or inspired or motivated or can help people come together.
And Gemini, I just want to throw this out there. Gemini being the queer babe, like, Gemini is not in any realm, you know what I'm saying? Like non-binary, trans representation stuff, bisexuality.
Love it.
Etc.
Absolutely. So this is kind of the final question I wanted to leave us on because this has been such a thread, and even just what you shared about your Mars and Virgo ruling your 11th house of Scorpio. You mentioned, and you've talked a lot about that writing is a solitary creative practice, but it's done with the intent to connect with and relate to others. So in this present moment in time where you're at in this Saturn return journey and just in your kind of labyrinth of life that you're journeying through, Aryn, how does your writing support the building of community here in Milwaukee, or even, digitally and reaching farther than Milwaukee? How are you practicing that right now?
I think two different ways I'm practicing it. In the nonfiction kind of writing my own truth, it helps other people connect with their truth. And I think when you see other people telling the truth, you want to tell the truth. And it creates that culture and that platform of honesty, transparency, vulnerability, the ability to speak even if you are messy or imperfect, and that you are working through that articulation. That feels in service of my community, where we can, in some ways, like, and it's the same thing for me. I see other people doing it and I want to do it, or other people in my life encourage me to be honest and transparent and real. And so that's one way I think. The other way with my creativity feels very aligned with how artists are so important to revolutionary practices and processes, because we are literally have the ability to create new worlds. And so one thing I'm exploring with my astrology practice is using the birth chart as creative tools for writing stories and writing myth, like myth explains something. And so can we write personal myths to explain things about ourselves, maybe even in ways that we've never thought, or taking archetypes that perhaps we connect really, really closely with this, but what if we like did a different one? Or what if we tweaked it a little bit? And so I'm really interested in that process of how we can really rewrite ourselves, like writing as a tool to create new narratives. Because if we don't create narratives, narratives create us. And we live in a society of narratives that are given to us, right? And we can accept that or not. And I think writers have this amazing ability to be like, actually, I'm going to reject that narrative and write this one. So yeah.
Do you have any advice for any aspiring writers or novelists or artists out there?
Ooh, I would say write about the things that light you up. And oftentimes you'll find that the things that light you up are the things that are the scariest to say. If you connect deeply to your writing and you feel it and you're really speaking from a place of truth, other people feel that way too. And so also it's a risk to write in that way, but it's a risk that often leads to more connection.
Thanks, Aryn. Where can our listeners connect with you and support your work?
Yeah. So I have two Instagrams. Aryn.Scanlon is more of my writing one where I'm aiming to post more about my experience querying my novel, and I post more of my poetry there. My astrology Instagram though is Aryn.the.alchemist. And I also have a TikTok as well. That's where you can find more about my astrology practice, which is very interwoven with my writing practice as well. And I make memes. So you can check that out there.
Do you have a Substack?
Yes, and I have a Substack. For that one, it's just Aryn Scanlon.
We will drop all these links in the show notes so you can follow Aryn on all of these amazing platforms and really start to read their writing. They did, oh my gosh, I'm getting like excited thinking about it. They just wrote a piece on their Substack about Saturn as liberation. And it was one of those writings that unlocked so much for me because I'm Saturn in Aquarius. So I'm fully out of my Saturn return. And I'm in a Jupiter ruled year. So I've been kind of feeling like I'm apprenticing with Jupiter and kind of like I kind of was trying to leave Saturn behind. But Aryn's writing just unlocked how much I've just integrated all the Saturn, but Saturn is still very present in my life. So thank you, Aryn, for that piece. Highly recommend reading that. So follow Aryn. We'll share all their amazing links so you can support them. But what an amazing interview to kick off our interview segment. Thank you, Aryn. Dani, thank you for being such a fun co-host and interviewer. And Aryn, love having you as a co-host on this podcast as well. So thank you all so much. This has been Soul Connections, and we will see you next time.
Bye, y'all.